The pavement was cold against his bones, but Richard Jameson didn't move. His back hunched beneath the threadbare coat he'd picked up from a downtown shelter, and his hands, once perfectly manicured, accustomed to cufflinks and $500 pens, now cracked and weathered. The wind cut through him, biting, but he welcomed it. Let the world forget who he was for a moment. Let his children reveal who they had become. From his place just outside the sprawling Rottiering gates of the Jamison estate, he could hear the echo of laughter drifting from the mansion's grand dining room. As golden lights shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows, they were toasting. To what? He didn't know. Perhaps to their father's extended health retreat in Switzerland. 2 months ago, Richard had disappeared into that fiction, a cleanse, a reset, a break from the business world. In reality, he'd shed the luxury suits and platinum watches, shaved his head, and vanished beneath the persona of a broken man. Now, he had returned, not to reclaim his empire, not yet, but to stand at his own gates, unrecognized, and see if any of his 3 children would open their eyes, or their hearts, inside. The air was thick with expensive wine and shallow conversation. Cameron, the eldest, held court at the head of the table, sleeves rolled to the elbows of his crisp white shirt, voice booming with the confidence of a man who'd been handed everything and believed he'd earned it. Naomi, radiant in a sequined dress, filmed a slow pan of the dinner spread for her 2.3 million followers, pausing only to angle the lighting just so. Devon, hoodie-clad and half-present, tapped endlessly at his phone, likely troubleshooting code, or diming some crypto startup investor. The housekeeper, Maria, had slipped away to answer the knock at the front gate, a dull, uneven tapping that pulsed like a faint heartbeat through the otherwise perfect evening dot. Maria hesitated as she opened the gate. The man was disheveled, grey beard tangled, eyes sunken, but something in them made her pause. Before she could speak, Naomi appeared at the top of the staircase, wineglass in hand, eyes sharp. "Tell that thing to leave," she said, voice slicing through the quiet. Cameron chuckled from behind her, already halfway back to his glass of scotch. "Probably looking for scraps," he muttered. Devon didn't even glance up from his phone. No one asked his name. No one noticed the flicker of recognition, the pain, the shame in the man's eyes. Richard didn't say a word. He simply turned, slowly, and sat back down on the cold concrete. The gate shut behind him with a metallic click. Inside, laughter rose again. Outside, Richard Jameson watched his legacy rot one child at a time. 12 years ago, when the cancer took a lane, Richard Jameson felt something in him splinter clean and final, like the snap of a branch too burdened by winter. She had been the compass, the warmth, the voice that softened his edges. After her death, Richard buried his grief beneath concrete and blueprints, expanding his real estate empire with a fury that masked his ache. He was already wealthy, but he worked harder, faster, building towers and townhomes, as if trying to resurrect her in steel and glass. And through it all, he tried to raise their 3 children alone, lavishing them with the comforts he could afford, hoping money might shield them from the cold he now carried inside. Cameron received the finest private school education and was placed directly into the company's upper management by 25. Naomi was gifted a downtown condo and a luxury car before she'd ever held a job. She turned beauty and charm into a social media empire. Devon, the quietest, was given a full ride to MIT, even though he wanted to build his own path in software. Richard gave them everything, thinking he was helping. But somewhere along the way, everything shifted. Cameron, now 35, had become a sharper, leaner version of Richard, but without the restraint. He spoke in terms of profit margins and leverage, dismissing relationships that didn't serve a purpose. "Feelings don't scale," he'd once said to a junior partner. At a recent board meeting, Richard watched from a distance, invisible in a back corner of the room as Cameron leaned back in a leather chair and announced 2 murmurs of approval. "We don't need him anymore. I'm already prepping to take over. The board's halfway there." The confidence was unmistakable. So was the ambition. Cameron wasn't mourning a father. He was circling an inheritance. Naomi, 32, lived in a world of curated posts and product placements. Her followers believed she was generous, engaged, deeply spiritual, but Richard, tailing her discreetly through the city, had seen the truth. She walked past unhoused people without a glance. She skipped the charity events she once co-hosted with her father, blaming migraines or schedule conflicts while posting poolside selfies in sponsored resort wear. She had turned her face into a brand and her soul into content. On her birthday, she toasted in a penthouse lounge to abundance, thanking the universe for aligning her life. Richard had stood outside the glass walls that night, wet from the rain, watching her celebrate a fortune she hadn't earned, unaware of the foundation it was built upon his sweat, his loss, and now his absence. Devon, the youngest at 28, was the hardest to reach, always more sensitive, more introverted. He'd retreated into code and headphones the moment adolescence hit. He was brilliant, but quiet, prone to overthinking, prone to silence. Richard hadn't known how to reach him then, and now, Devon had all but disappeared into a startup. He ran out of his apartment. He hadn't posted online in months. He rarely answered texts. He assumed, based on a vague family message and months of silence, that his father was off somewhere, either dying slowly or already dead. He checked out when Mum died, Devon muttered once to a friend, not knowing Richard sat just 2 tables away in a greasy downtown cafe, hearing each word. The pain in the boy's voice wasn't anger, it was abandonment. And that, more than anything, broke Richard's heart. Still, not everyone had forgotten how to care. Maria, the long-time housekeeper, had never stopped seeing people. Each morning she passed the strange, quiet man outside the gate, her eyes cautious at first, then softened by something she couldn't name. She never asked his story. She didn't pry, but some nights, after the family had gone to sleep and the leftovers had cooled, she slipped outside with a plate bread soup, the occasional piece of fruit, and handed it to him wordlessly. He thanked her in a gravelly voice. She nodded, eyes lingering on his face, feeling a pull she couldn't explain. Something about him felt familiar. She just didn't know why. Richard would eat slowly, silently, his hands trembling not from hunger but from grief for what he had built, and for how easily it had all rotted beneath the weight of wealth. The news came wrapped in expensive stationery and carried by a lawyer with a face too smooth to betray the weight of his message. He sat in the Jameson mansion's marble-floored sitting room, the one Richard had once filled with jazz on Sunday mornings, and delivered the blow with measured calm. Richard Jameson had been officially declared missing. If he did not return or make contact within 60 days, all his assets, personal and corporate, would transfer into a legal holding trust. Control would be suspended, operations frozen, and the children's access to funds restricted. The room turned still, as if someone had sucked the air from the walls. Cameron was the first to react, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This is absurd," he snapped, rising to his feet. "I am the company now. We're not pausing anything because some lawyer says Dad went ghost." Naomi, draped in silk and irritation, leaned back into the couch with a scoff. "We need to start liquidating non-essentials. Art, vintage cars, the extra properties. If he's not coming back, why? Let it all rot." Devon sat quiet, pale, absorbing every word. His fingers hovered over his phone, already thinking in code. Later, he would lock himself in his room, digging into old emails, IP logs, anything that might hint at where their father had gone. But for now, he simply watched as the family unraveled one thread at a time. Rain lashed the windows that night. As thunder rolled over the Houston skyline, It was the kind of storm that made the air feel heavier, like secrets were trying to breathe. Richard stood at the gate, soaked through and shivering beneath his soaked coat. He looked less like a testator, and more like a cautionary tale. His hair, now long and matted, clung to his forehead. His hands trembled, not only from cold, but from the knowledge of what he might find inside. He knocked. Maria opened the door and gasped, nearly dropping the bowl she was holding. "It's you," she whispered, blinking away the shock. "You." Again, he looked up with hollow eyes. "Just shelter," he rasped. "Please, just the garage." She hesitated. This was dangerous. This was foolish. But something in her heart, maybe the peace that remembered being a mother herself, wouldn't let her close the door. She nodded. "Come quickly," she said, leading him through the side path and into the garage, past the Rolls-Royce and the silent echoes of a life he had once lived. He curled up on a blanket behind an old workbench, unseen but not unheard. Through the thin walls, voices carried. Naomi's voice was the sharpest, rising above the clink of her wineglass. "I never cared if he came back," she said flatly. "I just want what's mine. Let the lawyers fight it out if they have to, as long as we come out on top." Her words sliced clean through the errand, through Richard. He leaned forward, the rain still dripping from his hair, his breath tight. In his throat, it wasn't anger that came, it was grief, thick, consuming grief, not just for her words, but for what they represented for the years he thought he was giving love, and instead had only handed them entitlement. Maria brought him soup that night without asking anything. He couldn't speak, only nodded his thanks. She saw the tears in his eyes and said nothing. Later, as the storm slowed and the silence thickened, Richard found a notepad tucked in an old toolbox. He sat down at the workbench and lit a single, flickering lantern. Then, hand trembling, he began to write. Not business plans, not legal notes, letters, one for each child, one for Maria, one for a lawyer he could still trust. The words poured out, not polished, not powerful, but honest. He didn't know what ending this story would have, but he knew now, if his children were to inherit anything at all, it would not be unchecked wealth, it would be the truth. Every day, the mask grew heavier. Richard watched from shadows, each hour revealing the widening cracks in the empire he'd built, not in the buildings or books, but in the hearts of his children. Cameron, always the strategist, had grown reckless beneath his polished exterior. Richard followed him one afternoon, unseen, to a private meeting in a downtown restaurant, where he overheard hushed threats delivered with a smile. "Vote with me," Cameron said, leaning close to one of Richard's former business partners, "or I'll have the press digging through your acquisition files from '09. You remember that little zoning slip, right?" Later that week, 2 vintage cars vanished from the estate's underground garage. One had been a gift from Elaine. Richard found the sales record online. Cameron had quietly offloaded it for liquidity. Legacy, memory, sentiment, none of it mattered. Cameron wasn't just preparing to inherit, he was clearing the path for a hostile takeover. Naomi, meanwhile, had taken grief and turned it into content. Richard watched her on screen, composed and camera-ready, giving tearful interviews about her devastated family and her father's disappearance. She spun sadness like silk, her voice trembling just enough for effect. But off camera, her true feelings spilled. "He should have died 5 years ago," she hissed to a friend in a cafe, unaware that the quiet man 2 tables over had once kissed her forehead goodnight every evening. "All this waiting is exhausting. Just let the trust release already." She clicked away at her phone, planning her next brand partnership, as Richard sat a breath away, his heart caving in on itself. Devon, at least, searched. He stumbled upon one of Richard's old journals in a storage box tucked away in the library. The leather was worn, the pages yellowing. Inside were entries scrawled late at night, pages filled with reflections about love, loss, legacy, memories of Elaine, regrets about time spent chasing deals instead of days with the kids, questions about how to pass on more than just wealth. But the handwriting was cryptic, the context unclear. Devon read one line, "How do you teach gratitude when you've already given too much?" and stared at it for minutes, unsure if it was about him, or Cameron, or all of them. He closed the book, confused, and set it aside. That night, Richard met Maria in the garage. The shadows cloaked him, but his voice gave him away. "It's me," he whispered, and when she looked into his eyes, the truth hit her like lightning. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Senor Jameson." She breathed, tears rushing forward. "My God, what are you doing?" Richard placed a finger to his lips. "Please," he said gently. "I need them to show me who they are. When they think I'm not looking, when they think I'm gone." Maria trembled with emotion. "But they're lost," she said. "They're angry, confused. They think you abandoned them." Richard looked down. "Maybe I did, but I won't give them a fortune just to watch them destroy each other with it. I need to know if any of them can see beyond the money." So he left tests, small, subtle cracks in the mirror. First, he drafted a check for $1, just $1, only anonymous, and left it in Naomi's mail. A note was attached, a gift with no strings attached. "What will you do with it?" She tore it in half without a second glance, muttering, "Probably some prank." The pieces fluttered into the trash beside a $9,000 handbag. Next, Richard mailed a flash drive to Cameron's office. On it were files, strategic plans, vendor relationships, sensitive merger forecasts, information only Richard could have had. The label read simply, "To those who protect, not plunder." Cameron plugged it in, eyes narrowing, then immediately sent. "It's a legal counsel with the subject line, Anonymous Breach. Investigate source. Destroy if untraceable." Lastly, Richard left a letter in Devon's mailbox, handwritten, no name. Just one question. Would you give back what you never earned? Devon read it twice, puzzled, and tucked it in a drawer without responding. The next morning, he logged into his financial dashboard and moved $10,000 into a dormant charitable account, but never spoke a word about the letter. Not to his siblings, not even to himself. Days passed, rain came and went. Richard remained hidden, a ghost in his own life. Then, one afternoon, Maria found him waiting in the garden shed. She handed him an envelope. "From Devon," she said. "He asked me to give it to you." Inside was a single note, scrawled hastily in familiar handwriting. "If this is you, come home. We need you. I need you." For the first time in weeks, Richard let himself breathe. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a confession or apology or blueprint for redemption. But it was a crack in the shell, a flicker of something real, maybe even hope. Day 58 arrived with heavy skies and the scent of rain, as if the world itself sensed a reckoning was near. The Jameson boardroom buzzed with anticipation's senior executives, seated, advisors on edge. The Jameson siblings poised in their usual formation, Cameron at the head of the table, Naomi scrolling through her phone with feigned disinterest, and Devon seated slightly apart, quietly observant. No one knew who had called the meeting. The email had been anonymous, urgent, bearing the company's seal and one cryptic line, "This concerns the future." Then the doors opened, and in walked a frail, weather-worn man in a threadbare coat. Gasps rippled around the room. Maria trailed behind him, her eyes brimming with emotion. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Richard Jameson removed his hat. Naomi stumbled back, her phone clattering to the floor. Cameron's face drained of color, as if the ghost of his conscience had finally arrived. Devon didn't move, just stared, jaw tight, the wheels in, his mind grinding against disbelief. Richard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. quieter than they remembered, yet resonating with a gravity none could ignore. "Everything I gave you," he began, eyes scanning the room, "I earned with scars, with years, with the love of your mother, and the nights I stayed awake wondering how to build a future for you." He looked directly at each of them. "But I made a mistake. I gave you everything except the chance to earn it yourselves." The room remained. Frozen breaths held. Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a small remote. He clicked it once. A screen descended behind him, flickering to life. Grainy footage played clips from security cameras around the estate, hidden mics, smartphone recordings. Cameron threatening a partner. Naomi mocking her father in a green room before a fake Rye interview. Devon silently passing over the anonymous letter unread. The room darkened with the weight of it. Gasps turned to murmurs. Someone from the board stood, stunned. Richard let it play in silence. When the screen finally dimmed, Richard spoke again. "You revealed yourselves," he said, "and now I will reveal mine." The announcements fell like thunder. "Cameron," he said, voice sharp with finality, "you are removed from leadership, effective immediately. Your ambition has poisoned this company's soul. I built it to serve people, not just shareholders. Your seat at this table is gone." Cameron stood, rage flashing behind his mask of control. "You can't," he began, but Richard raised a hand. "I can, I did, and I will defend it in court if I must." He turned to Naomi. "Your trust is frozen, not out of spite, but because I will no longer fund a life of performance over purpose. Your mother wanted more for you than designer lies." Naomi collapsed into a chair, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean it, I didn't know you were," but the words fell apart. Her tears came, hot and fast, but Richard's face did not soften. Then he looked to Devon. "You," he said gently, "you were the only one who looked for me, the only one who asked me to come home. For that, I'm grateful." Devon's eyes welled, but he didn't speak. Richard stepped closer. "But you're not ready to lead, not yet, so I'm offering you a job in customer support. You'll start small, earn your way, 1 year. After that, we'll talk again." Devon nodded slowly, a single tear tracing down his cheek, not from shame but something closer to release. Finally, Richard turned to Maria. He reached into his coat once more and pulled out a formal document, signed and notarized. He said, handing it to her, "Names you the temporary executor of the Jameson estate. You saw me when I was invisible. You fed me when I was nothing. That is leadership." Maria's hand shook as she accepted the papers. The boardroom sat in stunned silence. Cameron, face twisted with fury, shoved his chair aside and stormed out. Naomi followed, sobbing, trailing apologies that no one answered. Only Devon remained, unmoving eyes locked on his father. Richard sat down for the first time, weary but steady. The living will had been read not on paper, but in action, consequence, and truth. Weeks passed, and the storm that had shattered the Jameson family began to settle into something quieter, more reflective. Cameron, ever the fighter, filed a lawsuit within days of the boardroom reveal alleging manipulation, undue influence, and mental instability on his father's part. But the evidence, stacked high with footage, timestamps, and board testimonies, crushed his case before it ever reached court. His name began to disappear from business headlines. One by one, old allies distanced themselves. Behind closed doors, Richard learned that Cameron had moved out of the city, whether to regroup or simply to hide. No one could say. Naomi, meanwhile, fell completely silent. Her once daily uploads vanished. Her influencer deals dissolved. She hadn't posted in weeks, and in the strange silence of her digital withdrawal, her shame spoke louder than any video ever could. But Devon returned. He showed up at the estate one grey morning in a weathered hoodie, hair unkempt, and a tired smile that carried a new weight. "I've been working at a local help desk," he said, sitting beside his father on the back patio where Elaine once grew her roses. "Small company, not glamorous, but I'm learning a lot, mostly about people." He paused, then added quietly, "I don't want your money. I just want to learn who you were." Richard looked at him for a long time, then stood. "Get in the truck." What followed was not a lecture, but a journey. They drove for hours over the course of several days through old neighborhoods, past half-finished buildings, and into forgotten corners of Houston where Richard once worked construction under the weight of debt and dreams. He showed Devon the first duplex he ever flipped, the diner where he met Elaine, and the cramped apartment where they brought Cameron home from the hospital. He spoke not of profits, but of fear, hope, and how every brick came with a cost. "This isn't just concrete," he told Devon, gesturing to a modest housing complex. "This was groceries. This was skipped dinners. This was your mother waiting up every night, trusting me." Devon listened like a man starved for truth. For the first time, the legend of Richard Jameson faded on in its place. He found the man. Later, Devon sat at his laptop in the quiet of his apartment and wrote something he never expected the world would read. It was raw and unpolished, titled simply, "My dad was a beggar for 60 days, here's what I learned." In it, he recounted the hidden cameras, the tests, the letters, and how his father had been willing to give up everything just to find out if his children had character. "He taught me more with silence than he ever could with money," Devon wrote. "And now I understand real inheritance isn't dollars, it's integrity." The post spread like wildfire, reposted by media outlets, shared across platforms. Strangers reached out not with praise, but with reflection. Many confessed they'd never really seen their parents until it was too late. Back at the mansion, things changed. Maria, now officially in charge of the estate's day-to-day operations, kept the place running, not like a palace, but like a home. She no longer deferred to Richard as a man of wealth, but treated him with the respect owed to a man who had finally stepped down from the pedestal of power, and into the clarity of humility. She brought him coffee in the mornings without a word. They sat sometimes in silence, looking out at the gardens, no longer needing to pretend. Richard had once feared he would die surrounded by people who only wanted what he had. Now, for the first time in years, he lived surrounded by those who saw who he was. The morning was soft, the kind that came with a hush before the city fully woke. Richard sat on the same weathered park bench where, weeks earlier, he had curled up in the cold, anonymous and invisible, nothing more than a man wrapped in shame and silence. Now, the sun rose slowly over the skyline he had once shaped with ambition and grit. The towers still gleamed, but they no longer blinded him. Beside him, the spot was empty until Devon arrived, 2 coffees in hand. He sat without a word, passing 1 cup over as the steam curled into the morning air. For a long while they didn't speak. Birds flitted nearby. Joggers moved past with earbuds and focused eyes. The city moved on, unaware that something quiet and sacred was unfolding on an old wooden bench. "I thought I lost all 3 of you," Richard said at last, voice gravelly but open. Devon sipped his coffee, eyes on the skyline. "Maybe you didn't lose us," he said softly. "Maybe we were just never taught how to be found." Richard turned to him, the corners of his mouth lifting not in pride, but in recognition. There it was, the shift. Not in titles or fortunes, but in the understanding that love, like legacy, had to be built one honest brick at a time. They sat in silence again, the weight between them lighter now. Then Devon spoke, hesitating only slightly. "Dad, I don't need the name, but I'd be proud to build something that makes it mean something again." Richard didn't reply right away. He just looked out over the horizon, the city he'd once believed would define him. Then he smiled, small, quiet, content, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, peace settled into his chest. Not because of what he owned, not because of what he'd built, but because someone had finally seen him, not as a mogul or a myth but as a man.